Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting over episode 6 of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. Alright, so last we left off, the Elric brothers narrowly avoided an ignominious death at the hands of Scar. But unfortunately, despite their survival, they're still pretty poor off, and Ed's going to need to have his entire arm rebuilt. So, because that's the case, they're going to have to head back home to visit Winry to get Ed a new arm built. So we have a nice little character moment here where the Lieutenant Colonel sees off Edward Elric. And I think it's just a nice little thing because technically it's not his job or his responsibility, but he does it as a courtesy. It sort of shows what sort of a person that he is. So, unfortunately, the circumstances for the Elric brothers are a little less than ideal. They have to have an escort in the form of Major Armstrong, and Alphonse, no longer being able to pass as fully human, has to ride in the cargo compartment of the train, unfortunately. So initially, at least, the train ride is entirely uneventful. Major Armstrong reads, Edward sleeps, Alphonse presumably does not much of anything. So they stop at a train station along the way, and it seems like Major Armstrong has recognized someone. And beyond that, it seems that the plot is thickening nicely. The person that Major Armstrong thought he saw was a state alchemist who's sort of gone AWOL. His specialty is medicinal applications of alchemy, which obviously perks up Edward's interest, but this Dr. Marco doesn't want anything to do with anyone, it seems like. So, it seems to be a recurring theme, but Dr. Marco sort of had his change of conscience after the Ishvalan Civil War. So it seems like the war crimes that were committed were too much for him, but by talking to all the citizens, on all accounts, he's a good guy, and he's essentially the only doctor the village has. So the doctor is understandably fairly paranoid, considering he's essentially a defector. But fortunately for him, he was encountered by Major Armstrong and the Elric brothers, who are almost singularly good-natured. So it seems like, based on what Dr. Marco's saying, is that it wasn't even the war crimes, but rather the research he was forced to conduct. So it's not only that he feels guilty about the war in general, but rather he's doing this as a form of absolution. As fate would have it, his research pertained to the Philosopher's Stone, which proves it is indeed real. Of course, Ed doesn't seem to grasp the gravity of the situation. Dr. Marco's making it pretty clear that there's some really serious stuff that went into the stone. And most interestingly, he has a stone on hand, albeit in an aqueous form. He drops a little bit of esoteric knowledge about all the various names and how they all sort of correspond to different forms of the stone, even though they all have the same properties. So here we have a bit of an interesting character moment where Edward seems to be blinded by lust for the stone. And indeed, Marco is rather disquieted by the fact that Edward himself is a state alchemist. Perhaps understandably, Marco's a bit unnerved by Edward's determination. But of course, once he sort of explains the whole human transmutation things, it becomes a bit more understandable. So, Dr. Marco makes it pretty clear that seeking the Philosopher's Stone is a fool's errand, and it will only cause trouble and bring misery. So ultimately, Major Armstrong and the Elric brothers leave empty-handed for now. Of course, Dr. Marco isn't feeling especially positive about it either. So interestingly, Major Armstrong sort of brings it up. You you could have taken the stone by force from Dr. Marco. Why didn't you do that? And essentially, the Elric brothers' answers are because it wouldn't be right, and that the knowledge that the stone truly exists is good enough for now. And I think that's a fairly mature stance to take, especially considering how Ed had started acting briefly. It puts me in mind of Bilbo Baggins in relation to the One Ring. Just a brief moment of utter unreasonableness in the face of the thing they want. So ultimately, Dr. Marco gives the Elric brothers a bit of a clue on how to find his research. And he sort of makes it clear that his research is coded, but he's giving them all he can without just spoon-feeding them everything, so that if they're truly determined, they can figure everything out on their own. So even though Dr. Marco really only gave the Elric brothers the location of a library where his research is held, that's a considerably bigger lead than they've had in a while. So interestingly enough, the woman from before who was seen conspiring against the people of Lior has decided to pay Dr. Marco a visit for reasons unknown to us. The plot continues to thicken. So, back in Risenbull, the Elric brothers have finally arrived to the home of Winry and her grandmother. So it seems like the status quo is still in effect here back in Risenbull between Ed and Pinako. Unfortunately, the status quo seems to be in effect between Winry and Edward as well. She has a real nasty habit of throwing wrenches and other heavy metal tools as a form of greeting. Of course, it's somewhat justified considering his arm has been almost entirely destroyed. So, the Elric brothers are in a bit of a bind here, because they need to have their bodies repaired, but at the same time they want to get to Central Command ASAP in order to start searching the library. So, fortunately and unfortunately, the Elric brothers will have to wait a little while, but rather than a week like Ed thought, they're only going to have to wait 3 days. Of course, Ed also has to have his leg adjusted considering that he's grown some. Winry's looking at 3 all-nighters worth of work, but, she doesn't really seem to mind it, oddly enough. I certainly know that I would not be keen to work 3 all-nighters in a row. So meanwhile, while the Elric brothers are sort of milling about, Major Armstrong is helping by chopping lumber. So while they happen to be home, the Elric brothers take the opportunity to sort of go around town, I guess. Alphonse, unfortunately, is not very mobile, but Ed's taking the opportunity to visit his mother's grave. So, Major Armstrong's sort of giving Panako a bit of an update on the Elric brothers. You know, they haven't been able to write very often or at all, but that's often because their line of work gets them into trouble. Of course, the Major is quick to inform Panako that they are highly competent, but I don't imagine that would make me feel much better in her position. So now we get a little bit of history about Winry's parents. They were both doctors who died during the Civil War. And it seems to me that they were the subject of a bit of a war crime, since it's generally a faux pas to kill medical personnel even during a war. And considering the sort of early 1900s setting here, I'm pretty sure that even at the time in our world, that was the case, that it was a bit of a no-no to kill medics. We're also learning here for the first time that as soon as Ed gained his state alchemist license and the two of them left for Central Command, they burned down their childhood home, since essentially no one would be living there, and according to Panako, they didn't want to have anything holding them back. They didn't want any place to turn back. So they sort of forced themselves to move forward in doing so. So it seems like Panako spilled a bit more, and in doing so she sort of tugged at the Major's heartstrings. Of course, the Major is much more affectionate than the Elric brothers are comfortable with. So, true to her promise, Winry's been working all-nighters. And even though, Ed stops in, I guess, to bother her, she still just works tirelessly and just sort of shrugs him off. I'm a bit interested in what sort of tool she's using there. It seems like it might be a Dremel or something like that to sort of shape the metal bits. I would have expected more of a traditional blacksmithing sort of work that would go into building the limbs. At least in terms of the larger mechanical pieces. So just as promised, at the end of the 3 days, Winry has both of his limbs ready again. So once again, Edward has all his limbs together. And as soon as he patches up Al, they'll be ready to head on towards discovering the secrets of the Philosopher's Stone. So, Winry seems to have been giving Edward a bit of advice regarding the alloys used in his limbs. Apparently it's more resistant to rust, but it's a little less durable, and it seems like it might be a little bit more brittle. Surely this is not foreshadowing in any way. But, with his arm back, Ed can perform alchemy and therefore fix up Alphonse's suit of armor. So just like that, the brothers are back in tip-top shape, and they're prepared to leave first thing the next morning for the first branch of the Central Library. So interestingly, Winry seems to be in pretty good shape for someone who just pulled 3 all-nighters. She's put together enough to be, sentimental. So we get a nice little moment between Alphonse, Winry, and Panaka where they sort of affirm that they're all a family by relation, if not by blood. So, curiously, it seems like Winry's decided to sleep on the 4th day after appearing relatively fine. Ultimately, Winry does manage to make it in time to see the boys off. Edward probably isn't as grateful as he perhaps should be, but I suppose some of that just feeds into his character. So here we have one little interesting post-credits scene where Winry's sort of going through all of her various mechanical bits and bobs. And in doing so, she finds a screw, which seems inordinately important given its size. Alright, that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.